On the 17th of September, 1940, a palpable unease filled the conference chamber at the Reich Chancellery. Adolf Hitler addressed his assembled high-ranking officers, revealing that Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Great Britain, would be suspended indefinitely. He stressed that it was a postponement, not an outright cancellation, a distinction that held significance for him, though everyone present grasped the implicit meaning. This marked the first occasion since the commencement of hostilities that German forces had failed to achieve a crucial strategic objective. Throughout the summer months, the Luftwaffe had unleashed its full might against the Royal Air Force, yet the RAF continued to operate. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, meticulously documented this moment in his personal journal. He noted the British showed no inclination towards capitulation. Their fighter squadrons remained operational, and their radar installations, despite persistent aerial bombardment, continued to function. The invasion barges, amassed in ports across France, stood exposed and vulnerable to British aerial assaults. Halder's precise wording conveyed the enterprise's newfound impracticality. Nevertheless, this juncture was relatively early in the conflict. Germany commanded dominion over Europe, stretching from the Atlantic coast to Poland. The setback in Britain appeared to be a minor impediment, a single goal unfulfilled rather than a definitive limitation on German might. Hitler and his military leaders swiftly reoriented their attention eastward, toward the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was envisioned as a vastly different undertaking, grander, more decisive, and a continental campaign where German armored prowess and tactical genius had previously proven insurmountable. Halder dedicated the winter of 1940 and the spring of 1941 to meticulously planning the invasion of the Soviet Union. The proposed forces comprised 3 million men, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft, organized into 3 army groups poised to advance simultaneously towards Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. The projected duration of this campaign, as outlined in the planning documents, was between 8 and 10 weeks. By the onset of autumn, the Red Army was expected to be annihilated, Soviet industrial capacity neutralized, and German forces would occupy all territory west of a demarcation line extending from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan. On the 22nd of June, 1941, German forces breached the Soviet frontier at dawn. The initial engagements seemed to validate all preceding assumptions. Entire Soviet formations were encircled, thousands of tanks were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. By July, Army Group Center had advanced more than 400 miles. Convoys of German vehicles filled the eastward-bound roadways, with supply trucks struggling to maintain pace with the rapidly advancing spearheads. Halder's diary entries from these initial weeks exuded optimism. On the 3rd of July, he wrote that the Russian campaign had been effectively won within the first 14 days, with the remaining task being the occupation of territory and the suppression of lingering resistance. The Soviet Union was anticipated to crumble like a house of cards, with Stalin's regime unable to withstand such devastating military defeats. However, subtle indications within those same diary entries foreshadowed emerging difficulties. The sheer distances involved proved greater than initially estimated. Soviet resistance, while tactically overcome in individual clashes, never yielded psychologically in the manner observed with Polish or French forces. Disbanded units regrouped, and new armies materialized in areas where German intelligence had detected no prior presence. Furthermore, the Russian roads, transformed into quagmires by summer thunderstorms, significantly impeded the advance. By August, Halder's tone had subtly shifted. While still confident, he acknowledged complicating factors. The Soviets were exhibiting unexpected tenacity. German casualties, though statistically acceptable by military standards, were exceeding projections, and the valuable summer campaigning season was drawing to a close. The drive towards Moscow, intended as the campaign's climax, faced repeated postponements due to operations aimed at encircling Soviet forces in Ukraine. Throughout August and September, Hitler and his commanders debated strategic priorities. Halder advocated for a direct push on Moscow, while Hitler insisted on securing Ukraine's resources and Leningrad first. This disagreement consumed valuable weeks. German forces advanced in multiple directions concurrently, achieving tactical successes but sacrificing the concentrated offensive power that had defined the Blitzkrieg. October brought incessant rain. The Russian autumn, the Rasputitsa, a season of pervasive mud, rendered roads into treacherous rivers of muck. German vehicles became mired, and supply trucks were unable to reach forward units. Panzer divisions that had covered dozens of miles daily in June now struggled to advance a few miles weekly, and the temperature plummeted. Halder's diary entries from October 1941 paint a stark picture. He noted that German forces were nearing the exhaustion of their capabilities. Divisions that had commenced Operation Barbarossa at full strength were now operating at 60 to 70% efficiency. Tank units that began with hundreds of vehicles could now muster only dozens, and they remained over 100 miles from Moscow with winter imminent. November heralded the first significant snowfall. German soldiers, still attired in summer uniforms, began experiencing frostbite. Vehicles refused to start in the biting morning cold, and weapons became inoperable due to the freezing temperatures. Supply lines, already severely strained, now contended with temperatures dropping below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The final push towards Moscow commenced in mid-November. German reconnaissance elements reached the outskirts of Moscow, and the spires of the Kremlin were visible through binoculars, but further advance proved impossible. Fresh Soviet reinforcements, divisions mobilized from Siberia and equipped for winter warfare, launched counterattacks. For the first time in the war, German forces found themselves in retreat, not by design, but by necessity. On the 5th of December, 1941, Soviet forces initiated a massive counteroffensive along the entire Moscow front. German units, depleted and frozen, fell back in disarray. Some commanders sought authorization to withdraw to defensible winter positions. Hitler, however, refused. On the 16th of December, Hitler issued a strict halt order, mandating that all German forces hold their positions regardless of circumstances, with no retreats or withdrawals permitted. Units that found themselves encircled were to maintain their ground and await relief. Any commander ordering a retreat without Hitler's express personal consent would face a court-martial. This directive likely averted a complete rout, as German units, forbidden to retreat, dug in and endured the winter. However, it also trapped them in exposed positions, inflicting casualties from the cold and Soviet assaults that a strategic withdrawal might have mitigated. Crucially, it established a pattern that would recur throughout the remainder of the war. Hitler's prohibition of retreats and his insistence on holding ground, often overriding the tactical judgment of his generals. Halder's diary entries from December 1941 and January 1942 meticulously document the unfolding crisis. German casualties, resulting from both combat and frostbite, far exceeded projections by orders of magnitude. The army that had confidently invaded the Soviet Union 6 months prior, expecting victory within weeks, was now engaged in a desperate struggle for survival through the winter. The campaign intended to conclude the war in the East had instead opened a relentless front. consuming resources without apparent limit. Yet, even this did not immediately prompt the German High Command to fully acknowledge their loss of control. The winter crisis could be rationalized as a temporary setback, and Soviet resistance attributed to fanaticism rather than genuine military capability. The underlying assumption of Germany's ultimate triumph through superior tactics and willpower remained firmly entrenched. The spring of 1942 saw the launch of new offensives. Hitler decreed a drive towards the Caucasian oil fields and Stalingrad. The operation initially progressed favorably, with German forces advancing hundreds of miles across southern Russia. By August, they had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad itself. On the 24th of September, 1942, Hitler dismissed Halder as chief of the General Staff, appointing Kurt Seitzler as his successor. Halder had become perceived as excessively pessimistic and too inclined to suggest tactical withdrawals or consolidation. Seitzler, younger and more aggressive, was more amenable to Hitler's vision of total victory achieved through sheer willpower. Seitzler inherited a deteriorating situation. The Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, had pushed deep into Stalingrad and become embroiled in brutal urban combat, where every building transformed into a fortress and every street into a killing zone. Soviet defenders contested every inch of ground. German forces, adept at mobile warfare, found themselves engaged in a static battle of attrition for which they were ill-equipped. On the 19th of November, 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that successfully encircled the Sixth Army within Stalingrad. Within 4 days, over 250,000 German and Romanian soldiers were trapped in a pocket approximately 30 miles in diameter. Seitzler immediately recognized the peril and urged Hitler to permit the Sixth Army to attempt a breakout while they still possessed sufficient fuel and ammunition. Although the Soviets had closed the trap, it was not yet fully impenetrable. A determined breakout, particularly if coordinated with an external attack from German forces outside the pocket, might have succeeded. Hitler, however, refused, insisting that the Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had pledged to resupply the trapped army by air, recalling the earlier success at Demyansk. Seitzler performed the necessary calculations. The Sixth Army required a minimum of 300 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat effectiveness. Even under ideal weather conditions and without Soviet interference, the Luftwaffe would need to conduct over 100 sorties per day, utilizing their largest transport aircraft. In winter conditions, with Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft defenses actively engaging aircraft within the pocket's airspace, these numbers became logistically impossible. Seitzler presented these calculations to Hitler, arguing that Göring's promise was based on fantasy rather than practical logistics. The Luftwaffe, he contended, could not deliver the essential supplies. With each day of delay in a breakout attempt, Soviet forces tightened the encirclement, and the Sixth Army grew progressively weaker. Hitler remained resolute. The Sixth Army would hold, the Luftwaffe would resupply them, and German forces from the outside would break through to relieve the pocket. A retreat was psychologically unacceptable. To abandon Stalingrad would mean conceding the failure of the entire summer offensive, admitting that 6 months of intense fighting had yielded no tangible results. Throughout December, the Luftwaffe made valiant but insufficient efforts. Transport aircraft ferried supplies into the pocket, evacuating wounded on their return flights. However, they never approached the required tonnage. Soviet fighters shot down numerous transports, and blizzards grounded entire squadrons. On the most successful days, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver approximately 70 tons of supplies. On most days, the amount was considerably less. The Sixth Army began to starve. Rations were reduced to below subsistence levels, leading to widespread weakness among the soldiers. The wounded succumbed to a lack of medical supplies. Horses were slaughtered for sustenance. Eventually, even food sources were entirely depleted. Soldiers began to perish not from combat wounds, but from starvation and exposure to the extreme cold. Paulus transmitted increasingly desperate messages, reporting the annihilation of his army and pleading for authorization to break out before complete annihilation. With each passing day of waiting, more soldiers died, and the feasibility of a breakout diminished. Seitzler, along with Paulus, advocated for a breakout at numerous conferences, imploring Hitler to grant permission. Other commanders also voiced their support. Even Göring, confronted with the Luftwaffe's inability to meet its supply commitments, acknowledged the air bridge's failure. Hitler's response remained consistent. The Sixth Army would hold and would be relieved. Retreat was forbidden. Beneath these military justifications lay a profound refusal to acknowledge reality. Admitting the loss of Stalingrad would signify the war had irrevocably turned against Germany. Hitler could not accept this truth, and consequently, he denied it, with 250,000 men paying the ultimate price for his delusion. In January 1943, Soviet forces managed to divide the pocket into 2, then 4 sections. German resistance crumbled in stages. Paulus, promoted to field marshal in a final effort to bolster his resolve, surrendered on February 2nd. Approximately 90,000 German soldiers became prisoners of war, with only about 6,000 eventually returning to Germany years later. The news of this catastrophic defeat could not be entirely suppressed. Germany's propaganda ministry attempted to portray the defense of Stalingrad as a heroic sacrifice, a modern-day Thermopylae. However, the German public understood the implications. An entire army had been annihilated. The seemingly invincible Wehrmacht had suffered a defeat that was not merely tactical, but strategic. The war in the East was no longer a path to German victory. It was destined to become a relentless drain of men and resources until one side or the other collapsed. Within the high command, Stalingrad necessitated a re-evaluation. Seitzler and other senior officers began urging Hitler to authorize a strategic withdrawal to more defensible lines. It became evident that Germany could no longer sustain holding all its conquered territories. A more pragmatic approach would involve consolidation, shortening the front lines, and building reserves for future counterattacks. Hitler, however, rejected every proposal for withdrawal, insisting that all captured territory would be retained. Any retreat, in his view, would be perceived as weakness, embolden the enemy, and undermine morale. Consequently, German forces remained dispersed across vast expanses, unable to concentrate their strength and remaining vulnerable to Soviet attacks along the entire front. In the summer of 1943, Hitler ordered one final major offensive, codenamed Operation Citadel, aimed at reducing a Soviet salient near Kursk. A successful outcome would have resulted in the encirclement of substantial Soviet forces and the restoration of German initiative. The operation faced repeated delays as Germany focused on accumulating forces and developing new tank models. On July 5th, Operation Citadel commenced. German forces attacked from both the north and south, attempting to pinch off the salient. They immediately encountered the most formidable defensive system ever constructed. The Soviets, anticipating the assault, had spent months in preparation. Minefields extended for miles, anti-tank guns were positioned in depth, and reserve armies were poised for counterattacks. German forces advanced, but at a glacial pace and with catastrophic losses. The newly deployed Panther tanks suffered mechanical breakdowns, and Tiger tanks, though nearly invulnerable from the front, became bogged down in mud or struck by mines. After 8 days of brutal combat, German forces had penetrated approximately 10 miles into defenses that stretched over 60 miles deep. On July 13th, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. The Allied landings in Sicily necessitated the redeployment of troops from the Eastern Front. However, the more profound reason for the offensive's termination was its fundamental failure. German forces proved incapable of breaching the Soviet defenses. The offensive, intended to regain the initiative, instead starkly demonstrated that Germany no longer possessed the strength to achieve strategic objectives in the East. Guderian, who had closely observed the operation, delivered a blunt assessment. German armored forces had been shattered. Panzer divisions that entered the engagement with over 100 tanks emerged with only 20 or 30. Replenishing these losses would require months, and the Soviets were already launching counteroffensives. From Kursk onward, Germany found itself on the defensive in the east. Soviet forces attacked, and German forces retreated or held their ground before falling back further. This pattern persisted through late 1943 and into 1944. Commanders requested authorization to withdraw to more advantageous defensive positions. Hitler typically refused, only authorizing a retreat when positions became untenable and troops had been lost that could have been saved. The discourse within high command conferences shifted. Earlier in the war, discussions centered on which objectives to pursue. Following Kursk, the focus turned to which positions could be maintained and for how long. The question was no longer how to win, but rather how to avoid losing too rapidly. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces commenced their landings in Normandy. German forces in France, weakened by years of troop transfers to the Eastern Front, were unable to contain the beachhead. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, assessed the dire situation and concluded that Germany needed to pursue peace before the circumstances became utterly hopeless. He was not alone in this assessment. Other senior commanders, observing Germany engaged with the Soviets in the East, the Western Allies in France and Italy, and facing strategic bombing that devastated German cities and industry, recognized the mathematical impossibility of achieving victory. Continuing the fight would only exacerbate the destruction. On July 1, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, received a call from Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW. Keitel inquired, what should be done about the situation in Normandy? Rundstedt's response was blunt. Make peace, you fools. What else can you do? This candid remark led to his dismissal from command. Hitler would not tolerate defeatism or entertain any suggestions of negotiation. The war, in his view, would continue until either complete victory or utter destruction, with no middle ground. On July 20th, a conspiracy of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb at his headquarters. The attempt failed, and Hitler sustained only minor injuries. The conspiracy was brutally suppressed, resulting in the arrest, torture, and execution of hundreds of officers. This purge swept through the Wehrmacht, eradicating anyone suspected of defeatism or disloyalty. The failed assassination attempt and the subsequent purges effectively eliminated any remaining independent military judgment within the high command. Surviving officers learned to provide Hitler with the information he desired rather than accurate assessments of the situation. Military planning became divorced from reality, with operations ordered that stood no chance of success because no one dared declare them impossible. In August 1944, Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration in Belarus, resulting in the annihilation of Army Group Center. 28 German divisions were eliminated, with over 350,000 casualties. The entire central sector of the Eastern Front collapsed, and Soviet forces advanced more than 300 miles in 5 weeks, reaching the borders of Poland. In the West, Allied forces broke out of Normandy, and German forces in France retreated in disarray. Paris fell in late August. By September, Allied forces had reached the German border. Hitler's response was to order counteroffensives. In the east, German forces were instructed to defend every city to the last man. In the west, Germany would launch an attack through the Ardennes, intending to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and compel the Western Allies to negotiate. The Ardennes offensive, launched in December 1944, achieved initial surprise, with German forces pushing forward and creating a bulge in the Allied lines. However, they lacked fuel, air support, and encountered American forces that, after an initial shock, mounted an effective defense. Within 2 weeks, the offensive had stalled, and within a month, German forces had been pushed back to their original positions, having expended irreplaceable tanks and men in an operation that yielded no strategic gains. 1945 began with Soviet forces preparing a massive winter offensive. German forces in the east had been severely depleted by years of combat. Many divisions existed only on paper, fielding forces equivalent to battalion strength. Tank units were devoid of tanks, and artillery batteries lacked shells. The German army that had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 with over 3 million men now struggled to field a force of 1 million across the entire Eastern Front. On January 12th, Soviet forces launched their assault. German lines shattered, and within weeks, Soviet forces had advanced to the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. In the south, they had overrun Poland and reached Germany's own borders. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, reviewed production figures and casualty reports, reaching an unavoidable conclusion. Germany had lost the war, not was going to lose, but had already lost. Continuing the conflict would only intensify the destruction without altering the outcome. On March 15, 1945, Speer submitted a memorandum to Hitler explicitly stating this. The war was definitively lost. Germany's economic and military capacity was exhausted. Within 4 to 8 weeks, the German economy would collapse entirely. He proposed that efforts should focus on preserving what infrastructure remained to ensure Germany's survival post-defeat. Hitler's response arrived 4 days later. The Nero Decree, officially the Decree on Demolitions in Reich territory, ordered the destruction of all industrial, transportation, and communications infrastructure within Germany. If Germany could not win, nothing should be left for the enemy. Bridges were to be blown, factories demolished, power plants destroyed, and food stores burned. Speer, horrified by this directive, actively worked to sabotage its implementation. Many military commanders, recognizing the utter madness of destroying their own country, quietly disregarded the order. However, Hitler's intent was unambiguous. Should defeat be his fate, utter annihilation would be his choice. In the confines of the Führer bunker, deep beneath the city of Berlin, final discussions devolved into pure fantasy. Adolf Hitler, on maps, maneuvered non-existent army divisions, dispatching phantom counteroffensives with units that had ceased to exist. He unleashed his fury upon military leaders who dared to apprise him of Germany's dwindling strength. He cast blame on everyone: the generals who had failed him, the German populace who proved unworthy of his grand vision, the internal saboteurs who had sought to undermine him, yet never once his own flawed judgments. On April 16th, the Soviet military launched its decisive offensive against Berlin. The German defenders, a motley assembly of shattered Wehrmacht remnants, Volkssturm conscripts, and Hitler youth, fought with a desperate, almost suicidal valor. However, courage unaccompanied by adequate weaponry, ammunition, or even a sliver of hope proved utterly insufficient against the relentless onslaught of Soviet artillery and armored vehicles. Within the sanctuary of the bunker, Hitler's pronouncements grew increasingly detached from the grim reality unfolding above. He spoke of imminent rescue forces, of revolutionary new armaments that would swiftly alter the war's trajectory, and of ultimate victory still being within reach, provided everyone simply maintained their unwavering resolve to fight. The chasm between his words and the actual situation above ground, where Soviet troops were systematically conquering Berlin block by block, became an unbridgeable gulf. On April the 29th, Hitler formally wed Eva Braun and subsequently penned his final political testament. In this document, he accused the Jewish people of initiating the conflict, condemned the German populace for their perceived failings, and decried the weakness of his generals. It contained not a single admission that his own strategic blunders had driven Germany to ruin, no recognition that the war had been irretrievably lost years prior, and absolutely no acceptance of personal accountability. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler took his own life. Karl Dönitz, appointed as his successor, continued the doomed struggle for an additional week before capitulating unconditionally on May 8th. The trajectory from September of 1940, when Hitler opted to postpone the invasion of Britain, to May of 1945, when Germany surrendered without reservation, illustrates a progression from unshakable confidence to outright denial, culminating in complete delusion. At every juncture, the German High Command received irrefutable evidence that the war was not unfolding according to their projected plans. At each stage, certain officers grasped the dire implications, and at each stage, Hitler obstinately refused to revise his strategy to align with the prevailing circumstances. The discourse within the German military evolved dramatically. In the early days of the war, conversations revolved around which strategic objectives to pursue. Following the unexpected halt of Operation Barbarossa, discussions shifted to holding existing territorial gains. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, the focus became on evading enemy encirclement. Post the Battle of Kursk, the objective was reduced to merely delaying the inevitable downfall. By 1945, the language had deteriorated to whispers of miraculous interventions, the promise of revolutionary wonder weapons, and the abstract notion of sheer willpower triumphing over tangible material realities. What the German High Command expressed when the war entered a phase beyond their control was a steadfast commitment to continue fighting. They vowed to hold their ground, to never concede territory, and to ultimately achieve victory through sheer, unyielding determination. And when this stance became demonstrably impossible, they either fell silent entirely or uttered pronouncements so divorced from the actual situation that their very words served as undeniable proof of the complete breakdown of their command structure. The true tragedy was not merely Germany's defeat in the war, an outcome that had become all but certain by 1943. The profound tragedy lay in the German leadership's inability to confront this reality, leading them to prolong the conflict for another 2 agonizing years. thereby devastating Germany far more thoroughly than any external adversary could have accomplished. This inability to concede defeat stemmed from an insurmountable psychological barrier for the individual who had initiated the war and a military imperative of absolute obedience for the commanders serving under him. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's pointed remark to General Wilhelm Keitel in July of 1944, "Make peace, you fools," represented the most candid assessment of Germany's predicament from a member of the High Command during the war's final year. It was also the comment that led to his dismissal, for by that stage, speaking the truth about Germany's dire situation had become a far more perilous act than confronting the enemy on the battlefield. The war persisted not because German commanders genuinely believed in the possibility of victory, but because the singular individual who possessed the authority to terminate it adamantly refused to acknowledge defeat until Soviet ordnance was raining down upon his underground sanctuary, leaving him with no recourse but self-annihilation.